I am Madison Carter, 34 years old, and for months I had been dreading my parents' 20th anniversary party. In my family's eyes, I was still the one who left town with no plan, driving an old car and living quietly while my brother and sister built their picture-perfect lives. My sister could turn any conversation into a polished jab about how simple I kept things, and my brother never missed a chance to remind me who the real success story was. That night, under strings of gold lights by the river, I smiled through the small talk and the sideways glances, holding onto a truth no one in that room suspected. Then, just as the last toast ended and laughter rippled through the crowd, a deep rhythmic sound rolled in from the distance. Heads turned, glasses stilled. In the next moments, every assumption they'd ever had about me would begin to crack. If your family thought they knew your worth, how would they react to the one thing they never saw coming? Stay with me. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally picked it up again. The gold lettering on thick cream cardstock read in bold script that my parents were celebrating their 20th wedding anniversary in Riverbend, Oregon. I ran my fingers over the embossed border, feeling that familiar mix of warmth and unease tighten in my chest. It had been years since I'd been home for more than a quick visit. I told myself it was because I was busy building my company, managing teams, traveling for meetings, but deep down I knew the real reason. Going home meant walking back into a room where my worth was weighed against Robert's promotions and Vanessa's social calendar. Part of me wanted to go to see my parents smile and maybe catch a few familiar scents from my childhood. But I could already hear the condescending questions from relatives about whether I had found a steady job yet, or if I was still living in a cute little apartment in the city. They didn't know about the penthouse or the investment accounts. They didn't know about the deal I'd closed last year that changed everything, and for now I intended to keep it that way. 10 years earlier, I had left Riverbend with $300 in my checking account, a used laptop, and a stubborn belief that I could build something on my own terms. I rented a tiny studio above a bakery that smelled like sugar and yeast every morning, worked odd jobs, and coded at night. There were times I thought I'd have to pack it in, especially the year I maxed out every credit card just to keep the servers running. But in 2023, Carter Cyber Defense was acquired for $56 million. I stayed on as an equity partner, let my executive team run the day-to-day, and finally had the freedom to choose my next moves. I never told my family. At first, it was because I wasn't sure the success would last. Then it became easier to let them keep their assumptions. There was a kind of freedom in being underestimated. No one asked for loans. No one scrutinized my choices. No one tried to manage my life. I set the invitation down and opened my closet. If I was going to this party, I wanted to arrive exactly the way they expected. I reached past the tailored blazers and silk blouses to pull out a soft sweater with a small snag near the cuff. I paired it with worn jeans and my favorite sneakers, the ones with the faint crease at the toe. My hair I tied back into a simple ponytail. To anyone else, it might look like I was heading to a weekend coffee run, not a formal anniversary celebration. My assistant Megan raised an eyebrow when she saw my bag. It was an old canvas duffel I'd had since my early 20s, the zipper slightly frayed at one end. She stood in the doorway holding my usual leather carry-on and itinerary folder. "You're really going with that?" she asked, glancing from the duffel to my sweater. "This is how they expect me to arrive," I said, sliding my laptop into its sleeve. "If I show up in a tailored dress with designer luggage, the questions will start before I even walk in the door." "You're flying commercial too," she said, more statement than question. "Yes." She shook her head but didn't argue. "That's you." At the airport, I kept to myself, reading over a few reports on my phone between boarding announcements. The flight to Riverbend's small regional airport was short, under an hour, the kind where the attendants knew half the passengers by name. I pressed my forehead to the window as we descended, catching sight of the familiar bend of the river and the patchwork of fields beyond. A taxi was waiting when I stepped outside. The driver, a man in his 60s with a warm smile, helped me with my duffel and asked if I was in town for the anniversary party. Word traveled fast in Riverbend. I nodded, leaning back in the seat as we pulled away from the terminal. We passed the landmarks of my childhood, the red brick library where I'd spent entire summers, the hardware store where my dad would chat with the owner about fishing, the bakery that still had the same striped awning. It felt smaller than I remembered, though maybe that was me grown into a life far from here. As we crossed the old steel bridge into town, I could already picture the scene at the party. Robert in a perfectly tailored suit shaking hands and talking about his latest project in Seattle. Vanessa in something sleek and expensive gliding from table to table, while her husband Daniel recounted his last case win. My parents beaming at their friends, proud of the family they had raised. And me, the sister, in the background fielding polite but pointed questions about what I was doing these days. The taxi turned down my parents' street and slowed in front of their white craftsman house. The garden was trimmed, the porch swept clean. I paid the driver and stepped out into the crisp air, the scent of cedar and damp earth bringing back flashes of long-ago winters. Inside, I knew my mother would be making last-minute adjustments to her dress while my father checked the seating chart one more time. They would greet me warmly, ask how the drive was, and maybe offer to cover a hotel room if I needed it. I adjusted the strap of my duffel and took a deep breath. This trip wasn't about proving anything, at least not yet. It was about watching, listening, and seeing exactly where everyone stood before I decided how much of my real life they would get to see. With that thought steadying me, I headed up the path toward the front door, the sound of my sneakers on the wooden steps oddly loud in the quiet of the afternoon. Tomorrow night the party would change everything. But for now, it was just me coming home. By the time I walked into the restaurant the next evening, the sun had dipped low over the river and the string lights draped along the garden glowed warm against the early winter sky. The place was the largest event venue in Riverbend, with glass doors that opened onto a terrace lined with white tables and flickering candles. A jazz trio played softly near the fountain, their music blending with the steady murmur of guests greeting each other. I paused just inside, letting my eyes adjust to the golden light. The scent of fresh flowers and roasted salmon drifted through the air. My parents were near the entrance, smiling and shaking hands with guests as they came in. My mother's dark green dress shimmered when she turned to hug me, her perfume exactly as I remembered from childhood. My father clapped me lightly on the shoulder, his voice warm as he told me I looked great. It was all surface-level warmth, the kind you give to people you don't quite know what to say to anymore. Robert appeared almost immediately, his suit tailored so precisely it could have been poured onto him. His hair was slicked back in that careful way that said he had an appointment just for the occasion. He was surrounded by a small group speaking about some financial development project in Seattle. When he noticed me, his smile was polite, though his eyes skimmed over my sweater and jeans like they were an unfortunate accident. Vanessa swept in from the terrace wearing a silver gown that clung in all the ways she intended, Daniel at her side in a sharp navy suit. She kissed my cheek lightly, her eyes sparkling with that same barely veiled curiosity I remembered from our teenage years. I moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with aunts, uncles, and old neighbors. Most conversations began with some variation of how nice it was to see me, followed by questions that dug just enough to sting. Was I still in Portland? Did I have anything steady lined up yet? Had I thought about moving closer to home so I could be near family? I smiled, nodded, and let them think whatever they wanted. At the far end of the garden, a table of cousins waved me over. We talked about small things, the kind of chatter that fills space but doesn't require much of you. I was halfway through answering a question about the weather in Portland when Robert's voice cut across the conversation. He had turned toward me from his group, his tone loud enough to carry over the music. So Madison's still taking taxis everywhere. A few heads turned. I felt the brief pause ripple through the table, the momentary shift in attention as if waiting to see how I would respond. Robert's smile was smooth, the kind people use when they think they have made a harmless joke. I could sense the faint curiosity in the eyes around me, some amused, some uncomfortable. I sipped my water, keeping my expression light. For now, I said, letting the corners of my mouth curl just enough to suggest there was more I wasn't saying. Robert chuckled as if satisfied he had made his point and turned back to his circle of guests. Conversation resumed at the table, though I noticed a few lingering glances in my direction. It was the kind of moment that would settle in people's minds an image of me still quietly trying to get by. I let it be. There would be time enough to rewrite that picture. Across the garden, Vanessa was speaking animatedly to a group of women, her laughter carrying over the music. Daniel leaned against the terrace railing, scanning the crowd like he was taking stock of everyone's place in it. My parents moved from table to table, checking on the guests, their smiles fixed in that careful way that hosts do when they are making sure everything stays just so. I drifted toward the terrace doors, pausing to take in the view of the river glinting under the lights. The cool air from outside brushed against my face, steadying me. I could feel the undercurrent in the room, the subtle hierarchy that had existed in this family for years. Tonight was just a reminder of where they believed I belonged in it. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I took one, letting the glass chill my fingers. The music shifted to something livelier, and the laughter in the room rose with it. I leaned against the doorframe, watching the way the light reflected off the water, and waited. Tonight, I would let them have their assumptions. Tomorrow, they would see everything differently. The clink of glass against glass pulled my attention back toward the center of the garden where my father had stood and raised his champagne. Conversations quieted as guests turned their chairs toward him. My mother was at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile warm under the glow of the string lights. I moved closer, standing near a table of distant cousins, letting the gentle hum of the river mix with my father's words about love, perseverance, and 20 years of marriage. He finished to a round of applause, and people lifted their glasses. It was the perfect moment for sincerity, for everyone to bask in that easy warmth, until Vanessa's voice cut through the air. She was with a cluster of her friends and a few aunts, her silver dress catching the light as she turned slightly toward me. "Madison always keeps it so simple," she said with a bright smile. "Probably saves a lot of money since there is not much to spend." The laugh that followed came from more than one table. It was not cruel in the way a teenager's jeer might be, but it carried that subtle sting of something everyone had decided they were allowed to find funny. I felt the heat rise in my chest the way it always did when I was younger, and my choices or circumstances became a kind of public sport. I turned my head toward her, keeping my expression smooth. "Maybe tonight we'll have a little surprise," I said, letting the words hang there just long enough for a few people to glance between us. Her brows lifted for the briefest second before she sipped her champagne and looked away, still smiling to her friends. The moment moved on for most, but I could feel the shift, a tiny spark of curiosity igniting here and there among the guests. The rest of the toast continued, and people began to mingle again, but my mind stayed anchored in that moment. I could picture Vanessa telling the story later, adding her little commentary, secure in the belief that she understood me. That was the part that stung, not the words themselves, but the confidence behind them, as if my life could be summed up in a single shallow observation. I walked toward the buffet, filling a plate with a small salad and roasted vegetables, more out of habit than hunger. A few guests stopped to chat, most of it light conversation about the food, the decor, the music. But every so often, I caught someone's eyes linger on me a second longer, as if replaying what Vanessa had said. Near the dessert table, Robert was speaking with Daniel about real estate investments. His voice carried smooth and practiced, while Daniel nodded in that deliberate way of someone measuring his own value against the words. I could have joined, but I chose instead to circle back toward the terrace where the air was cooler. Outside, the night had deepened. The river was a dark ribbon under the lights, and the sound of laughter and music floated out through the open doors. I stood there for a while, watching the small ripples on the water. There was an odd comfort in knowing I did not have to correct anyone yet. That patience, that choice to hold back, felt like my own quiet power. Inside, a group had begun dancing near the fountain. My parents were making their rounds again, stopping to chat at each table, their hands occasionally brushing as they moved side by side. It was exactly the kind of image they wanted for this night, polished and gracious, and I wondered if they had heard Vanessa's remark. If they had, they gave no sign. As the evening stretched on, I found myself at a table with two of my mother's old friends, women who had known me since I was a child. They asked polite questions about Portland, about whether I was dating anyone, and I answered with the same light deflection I had used all night. The less detail I gave, the more they seemed to fill in the blanks themselves. By the time coffee was served, I had settled back into that careful rhythm of being both present and invisible, watching the interactions around me. Vanessa was across the room leaning toward one of her friends, her laughter sharp and quick. Robert was at the bar gesturing as he spoke, the sleeves of his shirt rolled neatly at the cuff. I stayed where I was, the warmth of the coffee seeping into my hands, my mind already picturing the moment tomorrow when the air would shift completely. For now, I let the night close in around me, all soft lights and muted music, the weight of unspoken things holding steady just beneath the surface. I stepped out toward the side corridor that led past the coat check, looking for a moment of quiet away from the music. The hallway lights were dimmer, the hum of the party fading just enough that I could hear the low murmur of voices ahead. I slowed when I recognized Robert's cadence, calm and deliberate, the way he always sounded when talking about money. Daniel's deeper tone answered him. Something about zoning permits and a closing date. I paused near a tall ficus, just close enough to catch the thread. They were talking about the riverfront lot our parents had inherited from my grandmother, the one that had been in the family for decades. Robert was saying a buyer from Portland was eager to finalize before the end of the quarter. Daniel mentioned the name like it was supposed to impress. I froze. I knew that name. 2 years ago, that same developer had been in the news for skirting environmental regulations and flipping properties with inflated appraisals. Another article linked them to a lawsuit from retirees who claimed they had been misled about the value of their investments. Robert's voice dropped a little lower, but in the stillness of the corridor I caught every word. If we play it right, Mom and Dad will think it is their idea. Daniel chuckled, a dry, self-satisfied sound. My first instinct was to walk in and confront them, but I stayed still, the cool wall against my shoulder grounding me. Confrontation now would just turn into a public scene, and tonight was not about them. I needed to keep the focus on what I had planned. Still, the thought of them manipulating our parents into selling to someone like that twisted in my chest. Robert shifted the conversation to numbers, tossing out figures in the high 6 digits, and Daniel nodded like he was already counting his cut. I took a slow breath, committing every detail to memory, letting their words settle into the part of my mind where I kept unfinished business. They moved farther down the hall, their voices blending with the faint clink of dishes from the kitchen. I stepped out from my spot and walked the opposite way back toward the glow of the main room. My smile returned automatically as I passed a group of my parents' friends, though inside I was already planning to dig deeper into that developer's recent deals. By the time I reached the terrace again, the cool air had shifted. More guests had stepped outside for a break from the crowded dance floor. Vanessa was leaning against the railing, phone in hand, tilting the screen away when she saw me. Her smile was thin, almost perfunctory. I nodded and kept walking, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of any reaction. Inside, my father was laughing with a local councilman, his arm around my mother's waist. They looked so at ease, so certain of the safety of everything they had built. I felt a pang knowing that in some corner of the evening their own children were making plans that would strip away a part of that legacy. I found my seat again, letting the familiar buzz of conversation wash over me. A server offered more champagne, and I accepted, holding the glass but not drinking. My mind was already split between the role I was playing tonight and the quiet storm I would bring later. From across the room, Robert caught my eye for a brief second. His expression was unreadable, but there was a faint curl at the corner of his mouth, as if he thought he held the upper hand. I looked away, letting my gaze rest on the flicker of candles along the tables, the silverware glinting under the lights. The band eased into a slower song, and couples began to drift toward the dance floor. My parents took the center, drawing a soft round of applause. I watched them sway together, her head resting briefly against his shoulder, and wondered how much of their trust could survive the truths I now carried. I finished the champagne in one slow sip, set the glass down, and stood. There was still time tonight to keep my role intact, to let them all think I was exactly who they believed me to be. The part about the land, the developer, Robert, and Daniel's whispered plans, that could wait. My surprise for them would come first. The hallway I had just left stayed in the back of my mind, each word from their conversation etched in sharp detail. For now, I slipped back into the current of the evening, my expression calm, my steps unhurried, letting the party fold me into its rhythm once more. A ripple of applause rose from a corner table where Robert was standing, one hand tucked casually into the pocket of his tailored navy suit. He was talking animatedly to a small cluster of guests, gesturing with his champagne glass as they nodded along. Someone clapped him on the back, and I caught fragments about a major investment opportunity and incredible returns. A few feet away, Vanessa was the picture of effortless grace in a silk emerald gown that shimmered under the lights. Daniel hovered nearby, laughing at something a woman in pearls had said, his posture confident in the way only someone used to being taken seriously could pull off. Guests drifted in and out of their circle, lingering for longer than they needed to each departure, leaving the two of them surrounded by more admiring faces. By contrast, conversations with me seemed to end before they truly began. A couple of my mother's friends offered polite smiles, then glanced toward the dance floor or the buffet table as though remembering someone else they needed to greet. I kept my expression pleasant, answering small talk about the weather in Seattle, about whether I was renting or buying, about if things were finally looking up. The sting came in small, unguarded moments. A man I vaguely remembered from high school, his hair now streaked with gray, stepped up with a half grin and said he'd always thought I might come back and run the old Carter market after my uncle retired. He said it like a joke, light-hearted, but I could feel the shape of the assumption underneath. I laughed softly, neither confirming nor correcting, and moved on. The room hummed with layers of conversation, each table a different current. Every now and then, I caught my name from across the space, wrapped in low tones, followed by a glance in my direction. I knew the image they had of me, and tonight I was still letting them keep it. But not for long. Near the dessert table, Robert was showing someone a photo on his phone. Their laughter rang out, drawing eyes, and he soaked in the attention with the ease of someone used to being the favored child. Vanessa across the room leaned in to hear a compliment about her dress, the other woman's hand brushing the fabric as if it were worth studying. I stood near the tall windows overlooking the river, the reflection of the room shimmering in the dark glass. My fingers traced the stem of my glass absently. A wave of cool air drifted in as the terrace doors opened, and with it came a familiar voice. Megan slipped to my side, her black dress simple but elegant, her hair pulled back into a low twist. No one here knew her as my executive assistant, and that was intentional. She smiled as if greeting a friend, her voice pitched just for me. "Everything's set. We're on schedule." I met her eyes for a moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. She adjusted the strap of her clutch and turned toward the dessert display, blending seamlessly into the flow of guests. I took another sip of champagne, letting the sweetness coat my tongue, and looked back toward the head table where my parents were laughing with the pastor who had married them. The warmth on their faces made my chest ache. They didn't see the condescension in the glances sent my way, or maybe they chose not to. Either way, they had no idea that the balance of this room would shift before the night was over. From somewhere behind me, someone called Robert, the pride of Riverbend, and a murmur of agreement followed. I let the sound wash over me, my mouth curving into a faint smile that had nothing to do with amusement. My gaze drifted to the clock above the bar. Not yet, but soon. I turned toward the dance floor as the band picked up a lively tune. Couples swirled past, skirts catching the light, shoes tapping against the polished wood. My mother waved me over, but I shook my head gently, mouthing that I would join later. Right now, I preferred the vantage point from the edges where I could see everything. Megan passed by again, this time with a small plate of chocolate-dipped strawberries. She didn't look at me, but her slight nod was enough. The wheels were in motion. Somewhere near the coat check, Robert's voice rose again, this time in mock surprise about someone's career change. Laughter followed, casual and bright, but I could feel the undercurrent of hierarchy in every interaction here. They believed they knew my place in it. I glanced toward the terrace doors where the breeze stirred the edge of the drapes. The river outside moved steadily past, reflecting only the faintest trace of the lights from the restaurant. Time was slipping closer to the moment I had been waiting for. The man from earlier, the one who mentioned the market, caught my eye again and lifted his glass in a small salute. I returned it politely, the corners of my mouth lifting. Inside, though, I was already picturing the look on his face when he realized just how wrong his assumptions had been. I let my shoulders relax, leaning back slightly against the window frame, and exhaled slowly. The night was still warm with laughter and music, but the air felt different now. Somewhere deep in my chest, anticipation thrummed steady and sure. The next time Megan approached, it would not be to confirm a schedule. It would be to signal that the show was ready to begin. The clinking of glasses was fading as my father wrapped up his thank you speech, his voice warm with pride. People were smiling toward the head table, a few already reaching for their jackets when the first low thump reached my ears. It was faint at first, blending with the hum of the band, but within seconds, it grew louder, distinct enough that several guests glanced up from their seats. The sound deepened, rhythmic and insistent, like the steady beat of a drum against the night sky. Conversations faltered. Someone near the door stepped outside, holding their hair back from the sudden rush of wind. Then another followed, and another, until a small stream of people was moving toward the garden. I caught Megan's eye across the room. She was standing near the bar, her posture relaxed but her gaze fixed on me. A barely perceptible nod passed between us, and she slipped out toward the terrace. The murmurs rose into a chorus of questions as the noise swelled. Robert had left his seat and was making his way to the French doors, his brow furrowed. Vanessa trailed after him, her heels clicking against the hardwood, Daniel just behind. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, letting the suspense build like the tightening of a bowstring. Then I moved, weaving through the tables as guests shifted to follow the commotion. The air outside hit me cool and sharp, carrying the scent of the river. The source of the sound was no longer a mystery. Over the line of cottonwood trees, the sleek silhouette of a helicopter emerged, its navigation lights blinking against the dark. The crowd gathered on the lawn, voices rising with excitement and disbelief. Someone said it must be a medevac, another guessed a politician. The rotor wash stirred dresses and scattered paper napkins, sending a gust of wind rippling through the line of waiting guests. The helicopter descended toward the grassy bank by the water, its polished black body gleaming under the floodlights from the restaurant. It landed with a controlled grace, the thump of the blades echoing off the river's surface. People shielded their eyes, hair whipping around their faces, a few laughing in astonishment. Robert stood near the front of the crowd, one hand gripping the lapel of his blazer, his mouth slightly open. Vanessa's eyes were wide, her fingers curled tightly around Daniel's arm. Behind them, my mother looked confused, glancing toward my father as if he might have arranged some surprise. The pilot, in a dark flight suit and headset, stepped down from the cabin and removed his helmet. His gaze swept the crowd until it landed on me. He smiled and walked forward unhurried despite the noise. "Miss Carter," he said with crisp clarity, the machine's roar fading as the blades began to slow. "Your ride is ready." Gasps and whispers rippled through the lawn. I stepped forward, the hem of my dress catching slightly in the grass, and felt the collective shift in attention as every eye locked on me. I let the moment breathe before speaking, my voice even but carrying over the din. "My ride's here. Who wants to come along?" A small stunned laugh came from somewhere behind Robert. My mother's mouth opened as if to ask a question, but the words caught. Robert looked from me to the helicopter and back again, his expression caught between confusion and something sharper, though he tried to mask it. I glanced toward Megan, who had appeared at the edge of the group, her arms folded loosely, her face calm. She knew the timing was perfect. The hush that had fallen over the crowd was thick, expectant. The pilot took a step back toward the aircraft waiting. I turned slightly, letting my gaze sweep over the familiar faces. Most of them were still processing the scene, their surprise written plainly in their posture and in the way they whispered to one another. The blade slowed to a steady, lazy churn, the air less violent now. Somewhere a phone camera clicked. The river glinted beyond the landing spot, its dark surface broken only by the shimmering reflection of the helicopter's lights. For a moment, no one moved. I could feel the weight of the reveal pressing just at the edges of the night, but I kept my expression mild, almost amused. The anticipation in the air was almost tangible, and I had no intention of cutting it short. I stepped closer to the pilot, the grass damp under my heels, and rested my hand lightly on the open door of the cabin. The leather seats gleamed inside, the faint scent of fuel and polish mixing with the cool night breeze. Behind me, someone murmured my name, but I didn't turn. The only thing I allowed myself was a small, private smile that none of them could quite read. This was just the beginning, and they didn't even know it yet. The pilot waited by the open door, his hand steady on the frame as my parents stepped forward first. My father glanced back at me with a mix of curiosity and hesitation, his hair catching the wash of the floodlights. My mother smoothed her dress, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear before climbing in. Robert followed without a word, the faintest crease between his brows. Vanessa hesitated, her eyes flicking over the aircraft like she was weighing its worth, then allowed Daniel to help her up. A few more close family friends invited. With a tilt of my head, rounded out the small group. I took the last seat, fastening my belt as the door shut with a firm click. The interior smelled faintly of leather and jet fuel, the seats soft and cool under my fingertips. The rotor noise swelled again, vibrating through the cabin as the ground began to fall away. The lights of Riverbend scattered beneath us, little gold flecks against the dark. The Willamette Valley unfolded in the distance, a wide sweep of silver river and shadowed vineyards under the faint glow of the moon. My father leaned slightly toward me, his voice raised just enough to cut through the headset static. "Madison, what exactly have you been doing these days?" I kept my gaze on the window, watching the quilt of farmland drift by. "Just working," I said lightly, as if the answer didn't matter much. My mother's tone was softer but tinged with the same uncertainty. "Working on what, sweetheart?" Before I could answer, Vanessa leaned forward, her hand resting on the back of my seat. Her eyes were sharp, her smile too thin to be friendly. "Renting a helicopter like this must cost a fortune. You sure you can afford it?" The pilot's voice came through the intercom, announcing our altitude. I adjusted my headset and turned my head just enough to meet her gaze. "You'll find out when we get there." Vanessa sat back, her mouth tightening, but she didn't push. Robert shifted in his seat, angling toward Daniel so that their shoulders touched. He murmured something low, his lips barely moving. I couldn't make out the words over the hum of the engine, but I saw Vanessa's eyes flick toward him, her brow creasing as if whatever he said didn't sit right. The cabin settled into a quiet that was almost unnatural, everyone half occupied by the view below. The river shimmered like a ribbon, and the faint outline of the Cascades rose beyond their peaks, still streaked with snow. My father pointed toward a cluster of lights along the water, telling my mother it was the vineyard they'd visited years ago. I let their voices drift around me, my own thoughts steady and deliberate. Each mile brought us closer, and with it the shift I had been waiting for. The wind buffeted us gently, the thump of the rotors, a steady heartbeat in my chest. Vanessa crossed her legs, the soft rustle of expensive fabric cutting through the hum. She glanced at Robert, then at me again, her curiosity impossible to hide. Robert caught my eye for half a second, and there was something in his expression I recognized from years ago before I left this town. Calculation. Daniel cleared his throat, trying for casual conversation. "So, Madison, this place we're going. Is it for work or fun?" I smiled without showing teeth. "Maybe both." No one laughed. The tension had settled like a fine mist, not thick enough to choke on, but present all the same. The pilot banked slightly to the right, and the cabin tilted just enough to give us a sweeping view of the valley floor. The vineyards gave way to stretches of pine forest, dark and unbroken except for a narrow road winding toward the river. Somewhere out there, the lights of our destination waited, ready to burn away every assumption that had been whispered in my absence. Robert leaned back again, his fingers drumming once on the armrest before going still. Vanessa stared straight ahead, her profile set in a perfect line, but I could feel her thoughts running. My parents exchanged a glance that was equal parts pride and unease. The cabin dipped slightly as we began our descent, the sound of the rotors changing pitch. In the distance, faint golden lights appeared scattered among the trees like a hidden constellation. I rested my hand on the edge of the seat, steadying myself against the shift. The air inside was warm, but my skin prickled with the knowledge that the next few minutes would redraw the lines between us all. The pilot's voice came through again, calm and measured. "Approaching the estate. 2 minutes out." I let my eyes stay on the lights ahead, their glow sharpening with each passing second. Behind me, Robert muttered something else to Daniel low enough that Vanessa had to lean in to hear, and when she did, her frown deepened. I didn't need to know what was said. Their faces told me enough. The lights ahead grew larger until the outline of the house took shape against the dark hills, a sweep of stone walls and tall windows catching the glow from the grounds. The helicopter banked slightly, and I caught a glimpse of the lake below, a silver curve framed by pines and rolling fields. My chest tightened, not with nerves but with the quiet thrill of watching their expressions shift when they realized where we were landing. The skids touched down on the broad lawn with a soft thud. A low ripple of wind rolled over us as the blades slowed. I unbuckled, stepped down onto the grass, and breathed in the crisp air tinged with cedar and earth. From here, the driveway curved up to the front of the house, lined with lantern posts casting warm circles of light. I turned and gestured toward the path. "Welcome." My parents stepped down behind me, their eyes drawn upward toward the sprawling facade. My father lingered a moment, scanning the two-story glass atrium and the wraparound balcony. Vanessa's gaze darted between the front doors and the wings of the house, extending into the dark, her lips pressing into a line. Robert looked like he was trying not to show surprise. Inside, the warmth wrapped around us immediately. The scent of fresh rosemary bread and roasted vegetables drifted from the kitchen. The polished oak floors reflected the soft lighting from iron sconces along the hallway. At the far end, Chef Anthony emerged in his white jacket, carrying a tray of amuse bouches, as if the landing of a helicopter in the yard was a weekly event. Megan appeared next, tablet in hand, her calm efficiency smoothing over any awkwardness. She had already arranged the living room exactly as I'd requested. Low, deep armchairs and a long sofa faced the stone fireplace. The flames inside threw gentle shadows up the wall. On the mantel sat framed photographs, a mountain trail at sunrise, a sailboat on open water, a patent certificate in its polished frame. "Please sit," I said, gesturing to the seating area. "Drinks will be here in a moment." They settled slowly, as if trying to decide where to look first. My mother kept glancing toward the panoramic window behind the sofa where the lake shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Daniel reached for one of the throw pillows, setting it carefully beside him. Vanessa crossed her legs and smoothed her dress, her eyes flicking toward the built-in shelves lined with books and awards. Chef Anthony and a second staff member appeared with trays of sparkling water, wine, and small plates. The quiet clink of glass on wood filled the room for a moment before I began. "I imagine some of you are wondering how this all came to be." Robert's gaze sharpened slightly. Vanessa's chin tilted in that half-interested, half-guarded way she had. "When I left Riverbend, I didn't have much. I took whatever jobs I could get while teaching myself product design in the evenings. The first company I tried to launch never made it past the prototype stage. I lost nearly everything I had, but I learned." I paused to take a sip of water. The fire popped, breaking the silence for a second. "The second time I worked with a small team to develop a diagnostic device for early detection of cardiovascular issues. We filed for a patent, refined the design, and secured FDA approval. It took years, but last spring I sold the company for $56 million. The words hung between us, heavy and deliberate. My mother's eyes widened, my father's mouth opened, as if to speak, then closed again. Vanessa's posture shifted, her shoulders pulling back as she absorbed it. I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle. The sale gave me the freedom to invest in this property. 40 acres, the lake, the gardens, and the renovations to make it exactly how I wanted. Robert's voice was measured when he spoke. "Impressive." He tilted my head. "Speaking of investments, I couldn't help overhearing you and Daniel earlier tonight talking about selling a piece of the family land to an investor from Portland." Daniel glanced at Robert before nodding. "Yes, we've had some discussions. Nothing final." I let my tone remain casual. "I think I may know the name. If it's who I suspect, I read some troubling reports about their past deals in another state. Real estate fraud, if I remember correctly." Robert's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak right away. "Of course, it's your decision." I continued, letting the sentence taper off. "I just thought it was worth another look before moving forward." The room went still except for the crackle of the fire. Chef Anthony moved silently in the background, setting down a platter of grilled vegetables and artisan cheeses on the sideboard. Megan slipped in from the hallway and leaned toward me. Everything's ready whenever you are. I gave a slight nod, my eyes still on Robert and Daniel. Vanessa broke the silence by lifting her glass of wine. Well, Madison, it seems you've been busier than we thought. I smiled faintly. Busier and quieter. Sometimes the best work happens without an audience. My father glanced around the room again, this time with a mixture of pride and something else I couldn't quite name. My mother rested her hands in her lap, her expression softer than it had been all evening. I reached for one of the canapés, the crisp bread still warm against my fingers. Outside, the reflection of the house shimmered on the lake, the steady hum of the evening settling around us. There would be time to say more soon. Tonight was still unfolding, and I had only begun to turn the pieces into place. I let the canapé rest in my palm for a moment before taking a slow bite, the warmth of the bread and the tang of goat cheese grounding me. Conversation murmured around the room, clinking glasses and low laughter weaving together like background music. I set the plate aside, folded my hands, and let my eyes travel over each face, storing their expressions like notes in a journal. There's something I've been meaning to share with you all. It's been in the works for quite some time, and I think tonight is the right moment. The hum in the room softened. Robert stopped mid-sip, his glass hovering just short of his lips. Vanessa shifted in her chair, one perfectly manicured hand smoothing the hem of her dress. My parents glanced at each other, curiosity flickering between them. After the company sold, I wanted to do something that mattered to me on a personal level. I started a nonprofit called Riverbend Haven. We provide comprehensive elder care services, medical, personal, and social support for seniors who want the dignity of remaining in their own homes or small community residences. My mother tilted her head slightly. Is this why you asked me all those questions last year about Dad's rehab stay? Exactly. I wanted to understand the cracks in the system firsthand. Now we have a roster of licensed caregivers, nurses on call 24/7, transportation for medical appointments, even programs to keep our clients socially engaged. I looked directly at my parents, which is why I'm telling you this. You will both have access to every single service we offer for life, no cost, no waiting lists. Whatever you need, it will be there. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint pop from the fire. My father's shoulders eased as though a weight he hadn't named was finally set down. My mother pressed her lips together, eyes brightening just enough for me to notice before she looked away. Vanessa's voice slid into the quiet. That's generous. It's the least I can do. I've been fortunate, and it only makes sense to use that in a way that actually improves lives. Robert set his glass down with deliberate care. Well, Madison, you've certainly been occupied. I let the smallest smile touch my lips. Speaking of being occupied, there's something else I wanted to bring to your attention. Earlier, I overheard you and Daniel discussing a land deal with an investor in Portland. Daniel's brow tightened. Yes. If you're referring to Hawthorne Ridge Holdings, you might want to know they're under active investigation in Idaho for property title fraud. The Attorney General's office has filed charges alleging a coordinated scheme that displaced several families. Robert straightened in his seat, his jaw working once before he spoke. That's a serious statement. It's not a statement, I said, keeping my voice steady. It's a matter of public record. I can send you the case files if you like. You'd be wise to have a contract attorney go through any agreement before you sign. These deals often hide liabilities in the fine print, liabilities that land squarely on the property owner. A draft from the chimney shifted the firelight across the room, throwing flickers of gold across Daniel's face. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. I'm sure this is a different situation, he said, though the edge in his voice suggested otherwise. Maybe. But when your family's land is involved, maybe it isn't good enough. Vanessa shifted again, crossing her legs and fixing her gaze on Robert. The silence between them carried a weight of its own, the kind that makes you realize a conversation will happen later out of sight behind closed doors. My father cleared his throat. That's good advice, Madison. I nodded once, letting the quiet stretch. I didn't need to press further. The point had been made. Megan appeared at the edge of the doorway, her tablet tucked close, eyes meeting mine with a subtle lift of her brows. Not yet, I thought, just the smallest shake of my head. There was still a mood in this room that needed to settle before the next step. I reached for my glass, letting the cool stem rest against my fingers as I glanced toward the windows. The lake outside mirrored the moon, perfectly unbroken, a single ripple away from changing. Inside, no one hurried to speak. Their thoughts were elsewhere now, sifting through contracts, headlines, and the question of just how much I knew and how much I was willing to say. The fire crackled again, loud in the absence of voices, and I let the sound fill the space between us. Robert shifted his weight in the armchair, the leather giving a faint groan beneath him. He kept his eyes on the flames, but I caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest in an unsteady rhythm. He was calculating, maybe debating whether to let the silence hold or break it before I did. When his voice finally came, it was lower than usual, stripped of its usual certainty. "I guess I've spent too long assuming I knew what was best," he said, almost to the fire. "For you, for this family. I thought what I was building here was the model, the way forward. And when I looked at what you were doing, startups, patents, selling companies, I told myself it was risky, short-term thinking." The words weren't an apology yet, but they were circling it. I kept my expression, still letting him continue. He glanced at me briefly, then away again. "Truth is, I was protecting an image as much as a business. The idea of success we could show people. You built something without the show, and I didn't know how to value that." I rested the glass against my knee, the stem cool in my hand. "Maybe the problem wasn't my work, Robert. Maybe it was the fact you couldn't imagine another way of being successful that didn't look like yours." His mouth pressed into a line, but before he could answer, Vanessa shifted forward in her seat. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the diamonds on her ring catching the firelight. "I've spent years making sure every picture, every invitation, every table we sat at sent the right message," she said. "That we belonged in certain rooms. That no one ever questioned us. And then you walked in tonight with all of this. And I realized how fragile that whole structure really is." There was no anger in her tone, only something raw and almost unsteady. "Maybe perfection isn't worth chasing," I said. "Real tends to last longer." Vanessa let out a small humorless laugh, as if she wasn't sure whether to take it as comfort or challenge. She leaned back, her gaze drifting to the windows. My father cleared his throat, leaning forward so his forearms rested on his knees. "Madison, we've both been guilty of underestimating you. I think we were so focused on making sure you were safe that we never considered you might be building something bigger than we could see. I'm proud of you." My mother nodded slowly. "I worried about whether you could take care of yourself, but I never thought to ask what you were actually doing. I should have trusted you more." Their words settled in my chest, loosening something I hadn't realized had been held tight for years. Daniel's voice, broken, hesitant but clear. "About the Hawthorne Ridge deal. I've been going over what you said earlier. If their partner is under investigation, we shouldn't just be cautious, we should be walking away immediately." Robert turned toward him sharply. "That property could sink us," Daniel cut in. "You've seen how fast reputations fall when they're tied to the wrong people. You can't PR spin your way out of a federal investigation." Robert stared at him, and for a long moment I thought he'd push back. But then he looked at me, and something in his eyes shifted, less resistance, more resignation. "You're certain about this?" I held his gaze. "Certain enough that if you go forward you'll be doing it without me staying silent." A long breath left his lungs, his shoulders lowering just slightly. "Fine, we'll pull out." The words seemed to ease something in the room. Vanessa's posture softened, Daniel leaned back, and my father's mouth lifted in the faintest nod. I set my glass on the table, the click of the stem against the wood sounding sharper than it should have. Outside, the moon's reflection rippled once in the wind, silver breaking into pieces before coming back together again. Robert rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I never wanted us on opposite sides, you know." "I don't think we have to be," I said. "But sometimes you have to see the whole picture before you realize you've been standing on the wrong side." The fire popped again, sending a small spray of sparks upward. No one rushed to fill the silence. It felt different now, less like a standoff, more like a room catching its breath after something heavy had shifted. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was movement. And I wasn't about to let it stop here. The voices from the other room began to filter in low and mingled with the faint clink of glassware. Someone laughed, the sound quick and a little forced, like they were still catching up to the tone of the evening. I set my glass aside and stood smoothing the front of my dress as I stepped toward the wide archway leading back to the main hall. The first to approach was Margaret Doyle, her perfume arriving a second before she did. She had been one of the loudest voices earlier this year when word got around that I had sold my company. Not the congratulatory kind, but the sort that came with raised eyebrows and whispered speculation about whether I had been pushed out. "Madison," she said brightly, like we'd been close for years. "I just wanted to say how impressed I am with what you've built. Truly inspiring. And if you ever find yourself looking for a partner on a new venture, I'd love to talk." I let my smile warm just enough to be polite. "Margaret, that's kind of you. But I think we're better suited to keeping our collaborations in the social space. That way we both get to enjoy them." Her eyes flickered just for a second before she recovered with a nod and a tight-lipped smile. "Of course. I understand completely." She moved on, her champagne glass tilted toward another cluster of guests. One by one they came. People who had once brushed off my ideas at networking events, who had looked past me in conversations to find someone they deemed more important. Now they wanted meetings, lunches, maybe just a way to attach their names to mine. I kept my tone light, gracious even, but my answers were carefully chosen. Some I redirected toward causes they might genuinely help with. Others I sidestepped entirely, leaving them with a pleasant exchange that offered no commitment. Near the windows, I spotted a familiar face, James Whitaker, a venture capitalist who had once told me over coffee that my patent portfolio was interesting but lacked the visionary leadership to make it big. Tonight, he shook my hand with both of his smile stretched almost too wide. "Madison, I have to admit I was wrong about you. I'd love to discuss a potential partnership. Something in green tech, perhaps." I tilted my head slightly, holding his gaze. "James, I think my focus is shifting toward community-based projects. But I appreciate the thought. I hope your fund finds the right partner for that." He hesitated, then nodded, the corners of his mouth dipping before he turned away. Behind me, I felt a gentle touch on my elbow. My mother's face was softer than it had been in months. "Everyone wants a piece of you now," she murmured, almost in wonder. I smiled at her. "They can want. I'm choosing." We walked together toward the buffet where Chef Anthony had set out trays of delicate desserts. My father joined us, carrying 2 small plates already filled. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said quietly. The words hit deeper than I expected. I took a breath, letting it settle before I answered. "I hope so." At the far end of the room, Robert was speaking with Daniel, his hands moving less sharply now. Vanessa stood beside them, her posture relaxed, her smile easy. When I approached, Robert glanced over and gave a small nod. Not the kind born of obligation, but something closer to respect. "You were right about Hawthorne Ridge," he said. "We've already drafted the withdrawal notice." "Good," I replied. "That will save you more trouble than you know." Daniel lifted his glass slightly in a silent toast. "Glad we caught it before it caught us." The conversation shifted then almost seamlessly to lighter topics. Vanessa asked about potential venues for the family's next celebration, my father suggesting something by the coast, my mother musing about renting a place in Napa. I listened, adding a few ideas of my own, and for the first time in years the talk felt like it belonged to all of us, not just to the image Robert wanted to project. Outside, the lake reflected the lanterns strung along the patio, the ripples carrying their light toward the dark line of trees. I found myself looking at it between sentences, aware of how easily this night could have gone differently, but it hadn't. And as the warmth of conversation wrapped around me, I knew I had turned more than just a few opinions. I had shifted the balance. The pianist in the corner began a slow, familiar tune, and the room seemed to draw a breath together, settling into something that felt for now like peace. Dinner began as if the house itself had exhaled. Chef Anthony and his team moved like a tide through the doorway, setting platters of roasted salmon with lemon and herbs, bowls of late-season vegetables glazed until they shone, baskets of warm bread that smelled of rosemary and sea. Salt. Candles pooled light along the long oak table, and beyond the glass, the lake held the moon like a coin. I took the seat between my parents and let the plates and conversation find their rhythm. My mother reached for my hand first. She told me the meal was beautiful and that the house felt peaceful. Then she laughed softly and admitted she had never imagined one of her children would host a family dinner with a helicopter parked by the lawn. My father added that he could get used to the view and that the salmon tasted like the coast in spring. Their words were simple, but the corners of their eyes had relaxed in a way I had not seen in years. Across from us, Robert poured sparkling water for Vanessa and Daniel, then for himself. He cleared his throat as if weighing how to enter the moment without breaking it. He finally said he had spoken too quickly earlier in the evening and that he did not intend to make decisions that put our parents or the family name at risk. Daniel nodded and said the withdrawal email to the Portland investor would go out in the morning, along with a request for written confirmation that no liens or claims would be pursued. Vanessa added that she was relieved and that she preferred the old trees on the riverfront to another development brochure anyway. Megan slipped in with a quiet check on timing, and I nodded that everything was fine. She disappeared toward the kitchen, and the music from the piano lifted just enough to weave through the clink of forks and low laughter. For a while we let the food carry the talk. My father told a story about teaching a student who could not pass algebra until he learned to fix lawnmowers, and how sometimes people need a machine to make the math real. My mother described the exact shade of blue the sky turns in October over the library steps. Vanessa surprised me by asking Chef Anthony for the dressing recipe and promising she would actually make it herself. Robert told a dry story about a board presentation gone sideways when a projector died, then looked at me and admitted he wished he had handled the awkward pause as calmly as I had handled tonight. I said I had help and tipped my head toward the hall where Megan had vanished. That opened the door to the truth about Riverbend Haven. I explained that the nonprofit already had 2 small residences open in neighboring towns and a third in permitting. I told my parents their names were already on the internal list so that any time they needed respite care, physical therapy, transport, or a nurse to check in, a coordinator would handle it without paperwork or waiting. My mother blinked fast and pressed a napkin to her cheek. My father said that took a weight off he had not wanted to name. Dessert arrived as slices of pear tart with a thin glaze. The conversation shifted to ordinary things that felt for the first time like they belonged to us. Vanessa suggested a family trip in the spring, nothing flashy, just a long weekend on the coast where we could walk the beach and forget to look at our phones. Robert said he could arrange the rental if I would pick the town, then caught himself and asked if I preferred he simply send options and let me choose. It was a small correction, but it landed. Daniel asked if I would be open to reviewing a pro bono idea he had for creating a simple legal checklist for seniors so they do not sign predatory contracts. He said he would donate the work if Riverbend Haven would host the clinics. I told him that sounded exactly right. When the plates were cleared, the piano quieted, and the house settled into that warm afterglow when no one is in a hurry to leave. We moved to the living room. The fire had burned down to a steady bed of coals. My father stood for a moment at the mantel studying the framed patent and a photo of a mountain trail. He said he did not understand half of what it took to get from one to the other, but he recognized grit when he saw it. My mother pressed herself into my side on the sofa and said that if I wanted Sunday dinners again, she would bring the pie and trust the rest to me. I looked around the room and let myself feel the fullness of it. The younger version of me might have wanted this night to end with a victory lap, a grand speech, a final proof that every slight could be answered. Standing here now, surrounded by the people who had shaped me and frustrated me and loved me imperfectly, I understood that revenge without repair is just another kind of emptiness. Tonight had started with a sting and the thrum of rotors over a river. It was ending with a table cleared and a family finding a way back to each other. We planned concrete things because concrete things hold when feelings wobble. Robert would send the withdrawal notice and ask the family attorney to review any future offers before he even brought them up. Vanessa would meet with the coordinator at Riverbend Haven to volunteer with the arts program twice a month. Daniel would draft the clinic checklist and schedule the first session for the community center in Riverbend. My parents would let the coordinators schedule a home visit next week to set up a care plan they could ignore until they needed it. I would split my time between Portland and the Valley for the next season and make room at this house for the noise of regular dinners. Close to midnight, the guests who had joined us earlier hugged my mother and shook my father's hand and thanked me with that careful tone people use when they are not quite sure how to name what they have witnessed. The night air had turned cold and bright. The lake was dark again, the wind laying it flat as glass. Megan checked with the pilot, then with me. We decided my parents would stay the night in the West guest room and that Robert and Vanessa would ride back to town. Daniel asked if I was sure he should not drive, and I said the pilot would prefer to make one last short hop rather than have everyone on the road. Before we broke for the night, my father raised a last glass of water and said he wanted to mark the date because sometimes families need a line to look back at and say that was when things changed. My mother added softly that she would sleep better knowing that when the time came for help it would arrive from a place built with care rather than fear. Robert said he would try to worry less about perfection and more about what worked. Vanessa smiled at me and said she would do the same. The hallway felt different when the house grew quiet. I walked Megan to the side door and thanked her. She said everything had gone exactly how it was supposed to and that she would follow up in the morning with the Haven team and the pilot. When she was gone, I stood by the glass and watched a light fade across the water as the last guests reached the gate. I went back to the living room and sat in the chair closest to the fire and let the heat touch my knees. The truth was simple. I could have lived my whole life letting my family believe I was small because small was safe and neat and demanded nothing from anyone. I could have made this night only about spectacle and power. Instead, I had chosen to show them the whole of me, the part that built companies, and the part that knew how to hold a hand through a hard diagnosis, the part that can afford a helicopter, and the part that prefers to walk. That choice felt like a door unlocked from both sides. If you are listening and some part of this feels familiar, if you have been measured by people who only knew an old version of you, I want to hear your story. Tell me where you are listening from and the moment you decided to stop shrinking to fit someone else's picture. If this kind of story gives you a little more courage to be seen, I would be grateful if you left a comment, tapped like, and subscribed so you do not miss the next one. Share this with someone who could use a reminder that quiet work still counts and that success can look like showing up for the people you love. Tonight taught me that the best kind of victory is the one that makes room for more chairs at the table.